The glass was halfway to my lips when my sister said it, at my parents' dining table, on a Sunday in April, with the whole extended family watching over roast chicken and my mother's good china. "Still single at 35, Jessica said, not even looking up from her plate, the way you'd mention the weather. Must be exhausting, being the only one who never figured it out." My mother laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a laugh meant to smooth over an awkward comment. A real, easy laugh, the kind she'd give at an actual joke, and it landed in the middle of that table like a small, precise blade. I set my glass down. I didn't slam it. I just set it down, deliberately, the way you put down something you've decided you no longer need to hold, and I said, "Actually, I think I've figured out quite a lot more than anyone at this table realizes." Part 1. The family I grew up in. To understand why that one sentence landed the way it did, you have to understand the family I grew up in. A family that had, for as long as I could remember, sorted its two daughters into very specific, very rigid categories, and had never once revised the sorting, no matter how much evidence accumulated against it. I'm Nadia. I was born in 1990, the older of two daughters, in a mid-sized city in Ohio where my parents, Farrukh and Dilnoza, had settled 6 years earlier after immigrating from Uzbekistan. My father worked as an engineer for a manufacturing firm. My mother, trained as a pharmacist back home, spent years requalifying her credentials in the U.S. while raising us, eventually building a modest but steady career at a local pharmacy chain. Jessica was born in 1993, 3 years after me, and from almost the moment she could talk, our family assigned us roles that neither of us had chosen, and that, over 3 decades, calcified into something that felt less like observation and more like doctrine. Jessica was the pretty one, the social one, the one who'd have no trouble finding a husband. I was the smart one, the serious one, a categorization that, in our particular family culture, carried an unspoken but unmistakable subtext. Smart and serious were consolation prizes, awarded to the daughter who wasn't going to be chosen the easy way. Jessica married at 24 in 2017 to a man named Marcus who worked in commercial real estate. And from that year forward, every family gathering became, in some fashion, a referendum on the two of us, Jessica's growing family. She had her first child in 2019, her second in 2021, held up as the model of a life correctly lived, while my own trajectory, a demanding career, an apartment I'd bought on my own in 2020, a life that looked, by any external measure, genuinely successful, was treated, consistently, as a kind of polite tragedy. A smart woman who'd somehow, inexplicably, missed her chance. I want to be honest that I spent years absorbing this framing more than I'd like to admit. I laughed along at family dinners when the jokes came. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew my own worth even if my family's arithmetic didn't quite capture it. But something in me had been quietly, steadily keeping score for a long time, waiting, though I didn't consciously realize it, for a moment when the actual numbers might finally get said out loud. Part 2. What nobody at that table knew. Here is what my mother and sister did not know, on that particular Sunday in April 2025, when Jessica made her comment about being 35 and still single, and my mother laughed along with it. They did not know that I had spent the previous 9 years building a career in commercial data infrastructure that had, by that point, made me genuinely, substantially wealthy, not through some lucky windfall, but through a methodical, unglamorous decade of work that none of them had ever bothered to ask enough questions to actually understand. I had joined a small analytics startup in Columbus in 2016, as employee number 14, taken a salary that was, at the time, considerably lower than what my engineering degree could have earned me elsewhere, in exchange for equity that my family had, at the time, treated as a mildly embarrassing gamble. Nadia's little startup thing, as my mother used to call it, in a tone that suggested she was being generous even acknowledging it existed. That little startup thing had been acquired by a much larger technology company in late 2023, in a deal reported publicly at the time at just under $400 million. My personal stake, after 9 years of equity vesting and a final negotiated buyout of my remaining shares, had left me, as of early 2024, with a net worth in the high 8 figures. A fact I had never once mentioned at a family dinner, partly out of a genuine, long-standing discomfort with discussing money, and partly, I now recognize, because some part of me had simply stopped expecting my family to actually be curious enough to ask. They also did not know that I was not, in fact, single, not in the way the word was being used at that table, as shorthand for lonely, for failed, for having missed my chance. I had been in a serious, deeply happy relationship for the past 2 years with a woman named Priya, a relationship I had chosen, carefully and deliberately, not to disclose to my family, given the specific cultural and religious weight I knew such a disclosure would carry in our particular household, and given how consistently, over the years, I had watched my family respond to difference with the same reflexive dismissal they'd applied to my career. I had decided, somewhere in the previous 2 years, that I would tell them eventually, on my own timeline, when I felt ready to weather whatever fallout might come. I had not decided that timeline would be that particular Sunday in April, but something about my mother's laugh, easy, careless, utterly certain of its own accuracy, changed my calculation in the span of about 4 seconds. Part 3, what I actually said. I want to be precise about what I said next, because the version that eventually circulated through extended family group chats in the days afterward became, predictably, somewhat exaggerated in the retelling. Here is what actually happened, as close to verbatim as memory allows. Actually, I said, after setting my glass down, I think I've figured out quite a lot more than anyone at this table realizes. Jessica, still mostly focused on her plate, gave a small, unimpressed laugh of her own. Okay, Nadia, what exactly have you figured out? For one thing, I said, I sold my stake in the company I've spent the last 9 years building, and I'm currently sitting on more money than this entire family has collectively earned across 3 generations. I wasn't planning to bring that up today, honestly, because it's never seemed like the kind of thing this family particularly wanted to know about me. But since we're apparently doing a full accounting of my life choices over roast chicken, I figured I'd add it to the record. The table went very quiet. My father set down his fork. My mother's laugh, still faintly hanging in the air a moment earlier, had evaporated entirely. And for another thing, I continued, my voice steadier than I expected, given how much adrenaline was moving through me, I'm also not single. I've been with someone for 2 years. Her name is Priya. I haven't told any of you because I've watched this family's reaction to things that don't fit the script for my entire adult life, and I genuinely wasn't sure I was ready to find out what that reaction would look like pointed directly at me. But I think, after today, I'd rather know. Part 4, the silence and what followed it. The silence that followed lasted, by my estimate, somewhere around 8 or 9 full seconds, an eternity at a family dinner table, when everyone is processing several detonations at once. My father spoke first, in the careful, measured tone he used when he was buying himself time to think. Nadia, he said, can you explain the company? How much are we actually talking about? I told him the approximate figure. I watched him do the mental math, watched something in his expression shift from disbelief into a kind of stunned recalibration. The specific look of a man realizing that an entire framework he'd used to understand his daughter for years had just been revealed as fundamentally incomplete. My mother's reaction unfolded more slowly, and in a considerably more complicated direction. Her first words, once she found them, were not about the money at all. A woman, she said. You've been seeing a woman for 2 years, and you didn't tell us. I didn't tell you, I confirmed, because I've watched how this family responds to things that don't match its expectations, and I wanted to protect something that mattered to me for as long as I reasonably could. Jessica, who had gone very pale throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke. Nadia, I'm sorry I didn't know any of this. I was just making a joke, I didn't mean. I know you didn't know, I said, and I want to be honest that my voice, at this point, carried less anger than a kind of tired, long-accumulated clarity. That's actually the whole problem, Jessica. You didn't know because none of you have really asked. For years. You built an entire story about my life, successful career. Sure, but fundamentally sad, fundamentally lacking. because I didn't hit the specific milestones you decided mattered, and you never once seemed curious enough to check whether that story was actually true. Part 5. The weeks that followed. What followed that Sunday dinner was not the clean, satisfying reconciliation you might hope for in a story like this, nor was it a complete, permanent rupture. It was, instead, a genuinely messy, extended period of a family renegotiating an understanding of one of its members that had, for over a decade, been built on assumptions rather than actual conversation. My mother struggled the most, initially with the disclosure about Priya, not out of financial concern, obviously, but out of a genuine, deeply rooted set of cultural and religious expectations she'd carried her entire life. Expectations that my relationship directly challenged in ways she needed real time to process. We had several difficult conversations over the following months, some of which ended in tears on both sides, some of which ended in long silences that felt, at the time, like they might become permanent. But something shifted, gradually, over the summer of 2025. My mother asked to meet Priya, hesitantly, at first, framing it almost as a formality rather than genuine curiosity. But the meeting itself, when it finally happened in June, seemed to soften something in her that months of abstract conversation hadn't managed to touch. Priya, it turned out, was patient and warm in exactly the ways that eventually made it hard for my mother to sustain her initial resistance. And by autumn, my mother had begun, cautiously, referring to Priya by name in conversation rather than the careful, deliberate non-references she'd used for months. The financial revelation produced a different, more immediately visible shift, not in how my parents treated me exactly, but in how the entire extended family suddenly, almost overnight, began treating my life choices with a curiosity and respect they'd conspicuously withheld for the better part of a decade. I noticed it clearly, and I won't pretend it didn't leave a complicated taste. The same career decisions that had been treated as evidence of my missing out for 9 straight years were, apparently, retroactively reclassified as impressive once an actual dollar figure was attached to them. I addressed that directly in a conversation with my father a few weeks later, one of the more honest exchanges we'd had in years. "I need you to understand," I told him, "that the respect I'm getting now doesn't undo 9 years of being treated like my choices were a disappointment. If anything, it's revealed something uncomfortable, that this family's respect has apparently always been conditional on outcomes, rather than genuinely curious about who I actually am and what I'm actually building, regardless of how it turns out." He didn't have a fully satisfying answer to that, and I didn't expect him to. But I appreciated that he sat with the discomfort of the question rather than deflecting it, which felt, in its own way, like a genuine step forward. Part 6. Jessica. My relationship with Jessica required the most careful, extended rebuilding, partly because her comment had been the specific spark that set everything else in motion, and partly because our particular sibling dynamic, the pretty one and the smart one, calcified over 3 decades, turned out to run considerably deeper than a single dinner table exchange could fully unravel. We had a long, difficult conversation in May, just the two of us, at a coffee shop neither of us had any particular attachment to, chosen specifically because it felt neutral, unweighted by family history. "I need you to understand something," I told her. "That comment didn't come out of nowhere for either of us. You've been making some version of that joke for years, Jess. Not always as sharp as that one, but the underlying message has always been the same, that my life is a kind of consolation prize. That being, the smart one, was always secretly a lesser category than being the pretty one who got married." I absorbed that story for a really long time. I'm not sure I even fully realized how much, until I heard Mom laugh along with it. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I think," she said finally, "I've spent so much of my life feeling like I was the family's designated success story that I never really questioned whether that story was actually fair to either of us. I got complimented my whole childhood for being pretty and easy, and you got complimented for being smart and capable, and somewhere along the way, smart and capable started sounding, in our family's specific dialect, like code for the one who's not quite enough on her own terms. I don't think I ever consciously decided to put you down to make myself feel more secure. But I think, looking back, that's probably exactly what I was doing, more often than I want to admit. It was, I think, the most honest conversation Jessica and I had ever had in over 3 decades as sisters. It didn't repair everything instantly. We spent much of the following year rebuilding trust in smaller, more deliberate ways, actually asking each other real questions instead of relying on decades-old assumptions. But it was a genuine beginning, built, finally, on something more honest than the roles we'd both been assigned as children and had never quite gotten around to questioning. Part 7. Building something new. By the following spring, almost exactly a year after that Sunday dinner, my family looked meaningfully different than it had before, not perfect, not fully resolved in the way a tidy story might suggest, but genuinely, substantially more honest. My mother had grown close to Priya, in a way that still occasionally surprised me, given how difficult those first few months had been. She'd started, gradually, including Priya in family gatherings without the visible tension that had characterized the early period, and by the time our family celebrated Nowruz together in March 2026, Priya was simply there, participating, welcomed, in a way that felt, finally, unremarkable in exactly the way I'd always hoped it eventually could be. My father and I had built a considerably more substantive relationship around my actual career, one where he asked genuine, informed questions rather than the polite, disinterested acknowledgments he'd offered for years. He'd even, at one point, asked if I might be willing to advise a friend's son who was considering a similar startup path. A small gesture, but one that represented, to me, a genuine shift from treating my career as an eccentric footnote to actually engaging with it as something worth understanding. Jessica and I spoke more honestly and more often than we had in years, having finally named and worked through the specific dynamic that had shaped so much of our relationship growing up. I don't think either of us fully escaped the roles we'd been assigned as children. Some habits of comparison, I suspect, never fully disappear between siblings. But we'd built, at least, a shared awareness of the pattern, which made it considerably easier to catch and correct when old habits occasionally resurfaced. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since that Sunday in April 2025, when my sister's offhand comment and my mother's easy laugh finally pushed me to say, out loud, at my parents' dinner table, 2 truths I'd spent years quietly carrying alone. I think often about how close that particular truth came to staying unspoken indefinitely. How easily I might have simply laughed along, the way I had at dozens of similar comments over the preceding years, and let another Sunday pass without disruption. I think about what it cost me, across those years, to keep those 2 significant parts of my life, my actual financial reality, my actual relationship, carefully hidden from the people who were supposed to know me best, out of a reasonable, well-founded fear of how they might respond. I don't regret the timing, exactly, even though it wasn't remotely planned. There's something clarifying about a truth arriving precisely at the moment it's needed most, rather than on some more carefully managed schedule. My mother's laugh that day wasn't cruel, not really. It was simply careless, the specific carelessness of someone who has told herself a story about a person for so long that she stopped checking whether the story is still accurate. Setting my glass down and finally correcting the record wasn't really about the money, or even primarily about Priya. It was about refusing, after over 3 decades, to keep quietly agreeing to a version of my life that had never actually been true. Priya and I got engaged this past winter, in December 2025. A quiet, private moment between the 2 of us first, followed a few weeks later by a family dinner where the news was met. This time, with genuine warmth rather than careful, managed tolerance. My mother cried, actually cried, the good kind, and told Priya, in a moment I don't think either of us will forget, that she was grateful to finally, truly know her own daughter. I think about that sentence often, finally, truly know her own daughter, because I think it captures, more precisely than anything else that happened that year, exactly what had been missing for over 3 decades, and exactly what, against every reasonable expectation I'd carried into that Sunday dinner in April, we finally, unexpectedly managed to build. By the end,